Hi guys, Omoras here. Today we have a brand new 14th gen i7 CPU, a Gigabyte B760 motherboard, and a few retired operating systems like Windows 98, which are about to run on real hardware. So let's see how that goes. This combo is actually an upgrade plan a friend of mine came up with. He asked me if it was a good idea to grab a 20-core i7 and a new DDR4 motherboard and reuse everything else from his 9th gen Coffee Lake refresh build. I said, yeah, why not? DDR5 prices are coming down, but they're still pretty high. So going with a DDR4 board can save you a lot of money, especially when you already have the RAM. Anyway, I've got my own plans with this setup. I'm going to grab whatever bootable SSD I can find and see which operating systems will actually load. We're talking about the usual suspects like Windows 3.1, 98 XP, maybe even Windows Vista. Now, Socket 1700 builds have been featured here multiple times, and yes, this platform is as retro-friendly as possible. But not all LGA 1700 motherboards are created equal. First, on the previous Asus motherboards I showed here, CSM mode turned on automatically when a non-UEFI compatible GPU was used. This Gigabyte motherboard, however, throws a VGA error by lighting up the VGA LED on the board. So first I had to use a GTX 960 just to boot in UEFI mode and enable CSM support, and that was it. After that it just worked with every non-UEFI GPU I tested. So can you guess which OS I tried first? It was Windows 98, of course. I'm actually using the same SSD that runs on my AM5 build, except on this configuration it boots from the onboard SATA ports. On my AM5 build, if I want to run Windows 98 from a SATA drive, I need to use an external SATA controller because the onboard ports don't behave properly in legacy mode. Also, in Windows 98, system properties can misbehave and fail to display the CPU model correctly, which is a bit of a shame, especially when you're running something like a 14th gen i7. The fix is simple. We need to replace the sysdm cpl file in the Windows/system folder with a patched version from Rudolph Flaw. And that's it. Now we can finally take a proper screenshot. Next, I tried installing the HD audio driver I showed you here on the channel earlier. This motherboard uses a common Realtek LC897 codec, the same one I have on my AM5 board, where it works perfectly with the new HD audio driver, but on the system it just wouldn't work. In many cases this comes down to how the motherboard allocates resources to the audio codec. I didn't have time to dig deeper, so I switched to a PCIe X1 sound card with a CMI A738 chip, which actually dates back to the Windows 98 era. These chip cards can be hit or miss, but this time my $10 card just worked. And here is some Need for Speed 2 Special Edition in action. And yes, this setup handles older games just fine. Those few titles that are sensitive to high CPU speeds already have issues even on something like a Pentium 2, so using an i7 doesn't really make things any worse. And considering this is about as powerful as a Windows 98 system can get, it has absolutely no trouble running more demanding titles like Half-Life 2 or Painkiller in Full HD with everything maxed out. Now, since I've already tested pretty much every Windows version on Socket 1700, I noticed two major differences right from I first booted into Windows 98. First, on previous Socket 1700 boards I tested, those were from Asus, the legacy USB to PS2 emulation only worked in pure DOS, and it was completely broken in Windows NT 95-98. On this Gigabyte board, though, not only does it work, but the emulated mouse behaves perfectly in Windows 98, with no workarounds needed. Why? Well, I'm not entirely sure, but all three boards run with an AMI BIOS, so the emulation code should be identical. The only difference is the Super I/O chip. This one uses an ITE chip, while the Asus boards use the Nuvoton chip, formerly Winbound. So probably it's the low-level code needed for the Super I/O that gets in the way, especially when a real PS2 port is present. And yes, this motherboard has a PS2 port, but it only handles one device at a time. So I used it with a keyboard and plugged a USB mouse directly into the board. Now let's get into some sort of bad news. Every motherboard reserves some amount of RAM for system use. So out of the first 4 GB that a 32-bit OS can address, we may see only from 3.5 to 1.8 GB left available to the operating system. But this Gigabyte B760 is definitely on the extreme end. For the first time, I'm seeing only about 850 megabytes left available to the OS, with roughly 3.2 gigabytes reserved by the BIOS. That's basically the opposite of what we used to see. So yeah, if we try to run something like the 32-bit Windows 10 on this board, we'll only have around 850 megabytes of usable RAM. The same applies to Windows XP, Windows 98 or any other 32-bit OS. Now Windows 98 will of course fly with 850 megabytes of RAM, but if we want to play Crysis on XP Service Pack 3 like it's 2007 again, staying under 1 gigabyte isn't exactly ideal. And that's what makes this board stand out, but not in a good way. Next, I tried Windows XP, the X64 edition, and guess what? Now we finally have access to all the RAM. So what was going on with all that reserved memory we can't actually use with a 32-bit OS? Well, PCI and PCIe devices use something called memory mapped I/O, which means they need part of a system's address space to communicate with the CPU. For compatibility reasons, this space is usually mapped within the first 4 gigabytes of address space, which is all a typical 32-bit OS can handle natively. The problem is if that address range overlaps with physical RAM, and nowadays always does, since we do have more than 4 gigabytes of RAM, well, that portion of memory becomes inaccessible because those addresses are already being used by hardware. But in a 64-bit OS, that memory can be remapped above the 4 gigabyte limit, which means we get full access to it again. So in practice, this stops being an issue once we move to a 64-bit OS. Also, here is Windows Vista 64 running on this configuration. And no surprises here, everything works, almost. There is just one unresolved issue. We can't rate the system. The Windows System Assessment tool crashes if the CPU has more than 16 megabytes of L3 cache. This seems to be caused by a hard-coded buffer limitation that fails during memory testing on CPUs with larger cache sizes. So far I couldn't find a proper workaround, except switching to an i3 CPU with 12 megabytes of L3 cache just to complete the test. Now let's go back to a 32-bit OS again. So here we have a Windows NT 4, an OS that can run on as little as 12 megabytes of RAM. So having just around 850 megabytes, I think it's alright for everyday use. For Windows NT, I had to swap the GeForce 7900GS with a Quadro FX 4500. These cards are very similar, but only the Quadro version can be installed in Windows NT. And as far as I know, this is the fastest and most advanced GPU that still works properly with Windows NT. And the best part is that some OpenGL games can run perfectly fine on this 1996 OS. By the way, this year Windows NT turns 30, and Socket 1700 seems to be the last consumer Intel platform with built-in classic BIOS support through the CSM module. So this means we're dealing with the last Intel CPUs that can run all these legacy operating systems on bare metal. And this is definitely something to keep in mind for the future. If we already have such a configuration, we might turn it later into a retro modern Windows machine, something that can run the next Windows, but also Windows 7, XP, and why not even Windows 98 and 3.1. And if you're wondering, I'm already doing exactly that. And finally, let's end where we left off in the last video, to Windows 3.1. And of course, it works straight from the onboard setup ports. Anyway, to boot, I had to use the /M1 switch for high memsys. But aside from that, I used the same SSD from my M5 build without any issues. So I guess that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.